I never meant to hurt him. That's what everyone says when they've done something unforgivable, isn't it? But I really didn't. I got carried away with the moment, trying to be the life of the party like I always am, like I always was. David and I had been married for 7 years when it happened. 7 years of comfortable routine, shared Netflix accounts, and morning kisses that had become more habit than passion. He was steady, reliable, everything I thought I wanted when we first met. A software engineer who worked from home most days, he preferred quiet evenings with a book to wild nights out. I used to find it endearing, how he'd push his glasses up his nose when he was concentrating, how he'd make me tea without asking whenever I looked stressed. But somewhere along the way, that steadiness started to feel like stagnation. I found myself looking at my friends' social media posts. Their adventurous husbands taking them skydiving, their muscular partners showing off at the beach, their successful spouses giving speeches at important events. And I felt something ugly growing in my chest. Something that tasted like dissatisfaction. David wasn't weak, not really. He was average height, average build, and while he didn't hit the gym regularly, he wasn't out of shape either. He just wasn't impressive. Not in the way society tells us men should be. He couldn't bench press twice his weight or intimidate other guys at bars. He solved problems with words and logic, not fists and force. And most of the time, I appreciated that about him. Until that night at Rachel's house. It was supposed to be a simple dinner party, just 4 couples getting together on a Saturday evening. Rachel and Tom, Sarah and Mike, Lisa and James, plus David and me. We'd known each other since college, watched each other get married, built our lives in parallel. These gatherings happened every few months, and they usually followed the same pattern. Good food, too much wine, reminiscing about our younger days, and complaining about our current jobs. But this time was different. Maybe it was the new brand of wine Rachel had discovered. Or maybe it was the lingering summer heat making us all a little crazy. Whatever it was, the conversation took a turn I never expected. Remember when that creep tried to follow me home from the bar senior year? Lisa was saying, gesturing with her wine glass. James saw him from across the street and scared him off. My hero. She leaned over to kiss her husband's cheek, and James flexed playfully. Tom's like that too, Rachel chimed in. Remember when those guys were harassing me at the grocery store last month? He walked up and just stared them down. They couldn't get away fast enough. I felt David shift uncomfortably beside me on the couch. He'd always been awkward during these kinds of conversations, when the topic turned to traditional masculinity and protective instincts. I should have noticed his discomfort. Should have changed the subject or at least kept my mouth shut. But the wine was flowing, and that ugly thing in my chest was growing, and suddenly I heard myself speaking. Well, I guess I'm screwed if anyone ever tries to mess with me. I laughed, the sound sharp and artificial. David here couldn't intimidate a mouse. The room went quiet. Not the comfortable silence of old friends, but the heavy stillness that follows something that can't be unsaid. I felt David go completely still beside me. And in that moment, I knew I'd crossed a line we'd never even acknowledged existed. But I couldn't stop. The wine, the frustration, the years of watching my friends' marriages while comparing my own. It all came spilling out in the worst possible way. I mean, come on, I continued, trying to play it off as a joke even as I felt the situation slipping through my fingers. He spends his days typing on a keyboard. The most aggressive thing he does is send strongly worded emails about coding errors. Someone, I think it was Sarah, made a weak attempt to laugh. But David just sat there, his face completely blank, and I watched as something in his eyes changed. Something fundamental shifted, like a door closing or a light going out. He didn't say anything, didn't storm out or make a scene. He just quietly set down his wine glass, stood up, and walked out of the room. A moment later, we heard the front door close. Well, Rachel said into the silence, that was something. The drive home that night was excruciating. David had taken our car, leaving me to get an Uber. I spent the entire ride composing and deleting text messages, trying to find the right words to fix what I'd broken. Nothing seemed adequate. When I finally got home, the house was dark, except for the soft blue glow of his computer screen coming from his home office. The door was closed, a rarity for him. David usually kept it open, saying he liked hearing me move around the house while he worked. It made him feel less alone during long coding sessions. I stood outside that closed door for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, my hand hovering over the doorknob. The sound of keyboard keys clicking steadily from within was the only indication he was there at all. "David?" I called softly, knocking gently. The typing stopped for a moment, then resumed at the same steady pace. No response. I deserved that. I went to bed alone that night, something we'd only done a handful of times in our marriage, usually when one of us was traveling for work. The bedroom felt enormous without him there, our queen-sized bed suddenly vast and empty. I kept expecting to hear his footsteps on the stairs, to feel the mattress dip as he slid in beside me, to hear his quiet goodnight in the darkness. But he never came up. The next morning, I woke to find his side of the bed untouched. In the kitchen, his coffee mug was clean in the dish rack. He'd made his morning coffee and washed up without waking me. His laptop was gone from his desk, along with the small backpack he used to carry it. On the kitchen counter, there was a note written in his neat, precise handwriting. "I'm going to stay at Mark's for a while. I need some time to think. Don't worry about work. I've already emailed them about working remotely for a few days." That was it. No "love you" or even his name at the bottom. Just those two sentences, as officially written as his code. Mark was his best friend from college, another software engineer who lived about 30 minutes away. They'd remained close over the years, though they mainly connected through online gaming sessions these days. Mark had never married, preferring what he called his bachelor paradise apartment, with its elaborate computer setup and collection of action figures. I called in sick to work. I couldn't face teaching third grade that day. Couldn't imagine putting on a bright smile and helping with multiplication tables while my marriage was potentially crumbling. Instead, I sat at our kitchen table, staring at my phone, wondering if I should call him. What would I even say? "Sorry I publicly humiliated you in front of our closest friends. Sorry I reduced your worth as a husband to your physical capabilities. Sorry I let 7 years of unacknowledged resentment explode in the worst possible way." The house felt wrong without him in it. I'd never noticed how much background noise David actually created. The soft whirring of his computer fans, his absent-minded humming while he worked, the gentle tap of his fingers on keyboards. Now there was just silence, broken occasionally by the hum of the refrigerator or the distant sound of cars passing outside. Around noon, Rachel called. "Hey," she said softly when I answered. "How are you holding up?" I laughed, but it came out more like a sob. "How do you think?" "Yeah, stupid question." She paused. "Look, about last night, I really don't want to talk about it." "I know, but Julie, honey, what's really going on? That wasn't like you." "But wasn't it?" Hadn't I been building to this moment for months, maybe years? Every time I scrolled past another friend's husband lifting her for a romantic beach photo, every time I watched action movies where the male lead protected his love interest, every time David chose to walk away from confrontation rather than engage. Hadn't I been storing all of that away, letting it ferment into something toxic? "I don't know," I lied. "I had too much wine. I was trying to be funny. I fucked up." Rachel was quiet for a moment. "You know, Tom may look tough, but last week he screamed and jumped on a chair because he saw a spider. And James, for all his muscles, he calls Lisa to kill the cockroaches in their apartment. We make jokes about the good stuff, Julie. We don't usually tear down our partners in front of everyone." Her words hit me like a physical blow. She was right, of course. When had I started focusing on what David couldn't or wouldn't do, rather than appreciating what he did? When had I started measuring him against some arbitrary standard of masculinity instead of seeing him for who he was? By day 3 of David's absence, I'd moved past denial and straight into panic. He wasn't answering my calls or texts, though I could see he was reading them. His social media status showed him as active occasionally, but he hadn't posted anything. The only indication that he was still functioning came from his work Slack channel, which showed him actively participating in project discussions, as if nothing had changed. That was so typically David, professional to a fault, never letting personal issues affect his work performance. I found myself wandering through our house, noticing all the quiet ways he'd protected and cared for me that I'd taken for granted. The security system he'd installed and meticulously maintained. The emergency kit in the garage he updated every 6 months. The detailed spreadsheet of our finances he kept, complete with retirement projections and emergency funds. In our bedroom closet, I discovered a small box I'd never seen before. Inside was a collection of items that made my throat tight. A printed map with all the hospitals between our house and my parents' place marked and ranked, along with alternate routes in case of emergencies. A laminated card with all my medical information, including allergies and blood type. A USB drive labeled Important Documents Backup. He'd prepared for every contingency, every possible way I might need help or protection. Just quietly, without fanfare or flexing or posting about it on social media, I sat on our closet floor, holding these pieces of evidence of his care, and really thought about all the times he had protected me in his own way. The night my car broke down on the highway, and he talked me through every step of getting it safely off the road while simultaneously calling a tow truck and tracking my location. The time I had a bad allergic reaction, and he calmly drove me to the ER while keeping me talking to monitor my breathing. The weekend my computer crashed with all my lesson plans for the upcoming week, and he spent hours recovering my files. He'd never once made me feel weak or helpless in those moments, never lorded it over me or turned it into a story to tell at parties. He just helped, protected, supported. And how had I repaid that? By mocking him in front of our friends. On day 4, I got a text from Mark. He's okay, just needs time. I stared at those 6 words for hours, trying to read between the lines. Was he just okay physically or emotionally too? Was he talking about me? About us? Did needs time mean he was considering coming back, or was he building up to telling me it was over? That night, I couldn't sleep. I went into his office, sat in his ergonomic chair that he'd spent weeks researching before buying, and looked at all the little details I'd been blind to. The family photos carefully arranged on his desk, not just recent ones, but photos going back to when we first started dating. A post-it note stuck to his monitor with a simple heart drawn on it, something I doodled months ago while bringing him coffee. His emergency glasses case, positioned exactly where I'd know to find it if he ever needed me to bring them to him. I opened his desk drawer and found a small notebook. Inside, in his precise handwriting, were lists of gift ideas for me, dates of important moments in our relationship, and random observations about things that made me smile. The last entry was from just a week ago. Julie seemed stressed about the upcoming parent-teacher conferences. Look into noise-canceling headphones for her prep work. He'd been thinking about how to make my life easier, while I'd been mentally cataloging all the ways he didn't measure up to some ridiculous standard. I closed the notebook and finally let myself cry. Really cry, not the shocked tears of the first night or the frustrated tears of the days that followed. These were tears of genuine grief and regret, of understanding exactly what I'd done and what I might have lost. Because the truth was, David had never failed to protect me. He'd just done it in ways that didn't fit into an Instagram post or make for an impressive story at dinner parties. He'd protected me from financial instability, from technical disasters, from my own forgetfulness sometimes. He'd created a safety net so subtle and comprehensive that I hadn't even noticed it was there. And in one thoughtless moment, I'd made him feel like none of that mattered. On day 7, David finally responded to one of my texts. Just 2 words, coming by tomorrow. My heart leaped and plummeted simultaneously. He hadn't said, coming home, just coming by. The distinction felt important, weighted with meaning I didn't want to analyze too closely. I spent that night cleaning the house manically, as if somehow having everything in perfect order would fix what was broken between us. I made his favorite coffee cake, the one his mom used to make, though my hands shook so badly while measuring ingredients that I had to restart twice. He arrived at exactly 10 a.m., punctual as always. I heard his key in the lock and found myself holding my breath, watching as he stepped into our home like a visitor, careful and contained. He looked different. Not dramatically, he hadn't gotten a radical haircut or lost weight or anything like that. but there was something in his posture and the set of his jaw that I'd never seen before. He seemed more solid somehow, more certain of himself. "Hi," I said, my voice embarrassingly small. "Hi," he replied, staying near the door. His eyes scanned the room, noting the cleaning, the coffee cake on the counter, the fresh flowers I'd bought in a desperate attempt to make everything feel normal. His expression didn't change. "Would you like some coffee?" I asked, already moving toward the kitchen. "I made your—" "Julie," he interrupted quietly. "Sit down, please." I sat. He remained standing, hands in his pockets, looking at a point somewhere over my shoulder. "I've been doing a lot of thinking this past week. David, I'm so sorry," I burst out. "What I said was horrible and wrong, and—" He held up a hand, and I fell silent. David never interrupted people, never talked over them. This was new territory. "The thing is," he continued, his voice steady but distant, "what you said at Rachel's, it wasn't really about me being physically weak or unable to protect you. We both know that's not true. I've protected you in plenty of ways over the years." I nodded eagerly. "Yes, I've been thinking about that all week. The security system, the emergency plans, all the ways you—" "Please let me finish." Another interruption, another crack in my heart. "What you said that night," he went on, finally meeting my eyes, "was a symptom, not the problem. The problem is that you're ashamed of me." "No," I protested. "That's not—" "You are," he said firmly. "Maybe not all the time, maybe not even consciously, but you are. You're ashamed that I'm not the kind of husband you can brag about at parties. You're ashamed that I solve problems with logic instead of force. You're ashamed that I don't fit some stereotype of masculinity you've built up in your head." He ran a hand through his hair, a familiar gesture that now felt like watching a stranger's habit. "And you know what? That's okay. You're allowed to want what you want. But I'm allowed to want someone who sees my strength for what it is, not what it isn't." The silence that followed was deafening. I could hear my own heartbeat, the tick of the kitchen clock, the distant sound of a lawnmower outside. "I love you," I whispered, because it was true, and because I didn't know what else to say. "I know you do," he replied, and his voice was gentle now, which somehow made it worse. "But you don't respect me, and I can't live with that anymore." He pulled an envelope from his jacket pocket and placed it on our coffee table, the one we'd picked out together at that little antique store in Vermont during our 3rd anniversary trip. The envelope looked stark and official against the weathered wood. "What is that?" I asked, though I knew. Of course I knew. "Separation papers," he said quietly. "I'm not asking for a divorce yet. I think we both need time to figure out what we really want. But I can't stay here right now." My hands were shaking as I picked up the envelope, but didn't open it. "Where will you go?" "I found an apartment. Short-term lease. It's actually closer to the office, though I'll probably keep working remotely most days." Always practical, my David, even in this. Can we try counseling?" I asked, hating how desperate I sound, unable to stop myself. "I can change. I can be better." He smiled then, but it was sad. "You shouldn't have to change who you are to be proud of your husband, and I shouldn't have to change who I am to make you proud. That's not what I meant. Isn't it?" He sat down finally, but on the armchair across from me, not beside me on the couch. "Julie, think about it. Really think. If I suddenly started going to the gym obsessively, picked fights with guys who looked at you wrong, became more traditionally masculine, I wouldn't be me anymore. And if you forced yourself to stop wanting those things to pretend you're satisfied with who I am, you wouldn't be you." The worst part was, he was right. Even now, part of me wanted him to yell, to show some dramatic display of emotion, to fight for us in a way that would make a good story later. And I hated myself for wanting that. "I need to get some things," he said, standing up. "I'll be quick." I watched as he moved through our house with purpose, collecting items he'd clearly already mentally cataloged. His favorite books, his backup hard drive, the small safe where he kept his important documents, the framed photo of us from our wedding day. He worked methodically, efficiently, the way he did everything. No dramatic drawer dumping or closet ransacking like in the movies, just careful, deliberate packing of the things he needed most. When he finished, he stood in our living room one last time, backpack and small suitcase in hand. "I'll come back for the rest later when you're at work." I don't want to make this harder than it needs to be. David, I said, standing up. Please, I love you. I love you too, he said, and I could hear the truth in it, which somehow made everything worse. But sometimes love isn't enough if there's no respect to go with it. He walked to the door, then paused. Without turning around, he said, You know what the ironic thing is? That night at Rachel's, when you made that joke, I had just finished setting up a comprehensive security system for the house that would alert both of us if anything ever happened while I was traveling for work. I was going to tell you about it that weekend. I had all the documentation ready, showing you how to access everything from your phone. He laughed softly. I guess it doesn't matter now. And then he was gone. I stood in our empty house, my house now, I supposed, and felt the weight of everything I'd lost. Not just my husband, but my best friend, the person who remembered to buy my favorite tea before I ran out, who knew exactly how to calm me down during thunderstorms, who protected me in 100 small ways I'd been too blind to see. The separation papers sat on the coffee table, stark and accusing. I thought about all the times I'd scrolled through social media, envying my friends' seemingly perfect relationships, never realizing I was poisoning my own. I thought about all the times David had quietly taken care of things, never bragging, never demanding recognition, while I'd wished for grand gestures and dramatic displays. I picked up my phone and deleted all my social media apps. Too little, too late, probably, but it felt like something I should have done years ago. Then I sat down and really read the separation papers, noting how carefully David had divided everything, how he'd made sure I would keep the house, how he'd arranged for all the utilities to stay in my name with automatic payments set up. Even in leaving, he was protecting me. The irony of that wasn't lost on me as I signed the papers, my signature wobbling on the line next to his neat one. I had joked that he couldn't protect me, and in doing so, I'd lost the person who had been protecting me all along. Sometimes the strongest people are the quiet ones. Sometimes the best protectors are the ones who don't make a show of it. Sometimes we don't realize what we have until we've broken it beyond repair. And sometimes the most painful lessons come wrapped in our own thoughtless words, echoing back to haunt us in an empty house that used to be a home.